I never imagined that opening the door that night would change everything. Standing there was Felipe, my son's best friend, with eyes that lingered longer than they should have. What started as an innocent visit quickly became something I couldn't stop, even if I wanted to. That moment wasn't just unexpected. It was the beginning of a thrill I hadn't felt in years. Amy had always been the definition of a devoted mother and wife. Life had dealt her its fair share of challenges, but she faced them with quiet resilience. After losing her husband, Charlie, 8 years ago, her world had become smaller, defined by routine, solitude, and memories. She poured all her energy into raising her son, Eddie, now a bright and ambitious 25-year-old who had started building his own career. Her evenings were often spent in the quiet comfort of her modest home, sipping wine by the dim glow of candlelight. She found solace in these small rituals, moments of reflection amidst the stillness. Loneliness, she told herself, was safer than opening her heart to someone new. At 60, Amy had convinced herself that passion and love were chapters of the past, best left in the memories she cherished. Enter Felipe. Eddie's best friend for years, Felipe had become almost like family. At 37, he was the epitome of charm and success, a charismatic man with a warm smile and an easygoing confidence that drew people in. Amy had always seen him as Eddie's friend and nothing more. But that night, when he showed up unexpectedly at her door, something shifted. Amy greeted Felipe with the casual warmth of familiarity, yet there was an undeniable tension in the air. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on her just a moment too long, or how his compliments carried a depth she hadn't noticed before. For years, Amy had kept a firm boundary between herself and anyone who might stir the long-buried feelings of desire and vulnerability. But Felipe, with his quiet presence and sincere admiration, began to chip away at her carefully constructed walls. What struck Amy most was how Felipe seemed to see her, not just as Eddie's mom, but as a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. His words that night weren't just kind. They felt personal, deliberate, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to say them. For the first time in years, Amy felt seen, and the loneliness she had wrapped around herself like a shield suddenly felt like a burden she no longer wanted to carry. The days following Felipe's unexpected visit left Amy unsettled. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Felipe's gaze, his words, the way he had looked at her, it all lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. Her routine continued as normal. Eddie was busy with his work, often staying late at the office or spending weekends away on business trips. Amy would distract herself with books, gardening, or the occasional TV show, but her thoughts kept circling back to that evening. She'd replay Felipe's words in her head, how he'd called her remarkable and hinted at her loneliness. They weren't just compliments, they felt like a confession. Then there were the little moments that began to feel suspicious. Felipe started showing up more often, finding reasons to visit Eddie's house even when Eddie wasn't home. He'd drop off work-related items, bring over groceries Eddie had forgotten, or just stop by under the guise of checking in. Each time, Amy felt her heart race, though she tried to mask her reaction with polite indifference. But Felipe wasn't subtle. His compliments became bolder, his conversations more intimate. He'd linger in the living room longer than necessary, sharing stories about his childhood, his dreams, his fears. Amy noticed how he'd sit closer than before, his body language open and inviting. And his eyes, those deep, searching eyes, seemed to study her as though he could see the parts of herself she had kept hidden from everyone else. Amy began to question her own behavior. She found herself looking forward to his visits, dressing a little nicer, putting on lipstick she hadn't worn in years. She'd tell herself it was nothing, just a harmless desire to feel presentable, but the truth was harder to ignore. She was seeking his attention, and when she caught him looking at her, she felt a thrill she couldn't explain. Then came the phone calls. They started innocently enough, Felipe asking if Eddie was home or seeking advice on a work project. But they grew longer and more personal. They talked about life, loss, and the challenges of navigating loneliness. Felipe confessed that, despite his successes, he often felt isolated. "It's strange," he admitted one evening. "People assume I have everything together, but some nights, the silence is deafening." Amy felt a pang of recognition in his words. She knew that silence all too well. It was the same silence that had accompanied her since Charlie's death, the same loneliness she had convinced herself was a choice. But hearing Felipe speak of it made her realize how much she had longed for someone to break through her solitude. Still, a part of her resisted. She knew this wasn't right. Felipe was Eddie's friend, almost a decade younger than her, and any sort of connection beyond friendship would complicate their lives in ways she didn't want to imagine. Yet, as much as she tried to maintain distance, the tension between them grew. It was in the way his hand would brush hers when he handed her a glass of wine, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else had. One evening, as Felipe was leaving, he paused at the door. "Amy," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I just want you to know, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Amy nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and watched as he walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and the growing suspicion that this was no longer just a harmless friendship. Amy's world, once so predictable and steady, had become a storm of emotions she wasn't prepared to face. The tension between her and Felipe had grown impossible to ignore. What had started as casual conversations now carried an undercurrent of something far more complicated, something forbidden. One evening, Eddie was out of town on a business trip, and Amy found herself alone again. The familiar silence of the house felt heavier than usual. She had just settled onto the couch with a glass of wine when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Felipe. "Hey Amy, are you home? Thought I'd drop by if you're not busy." Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation mixing with a thrill she couldn't suppress. She could say no, end this before it went any further. But instead, she found herself typing a response. "Sure, I'm home. Come by." When Felipe arrived, his presence filled the room in a way that felt different this time. He was carrying a bottle of wine and greeted her with that familiar warm smile, but there was a subtle intensity in his eyes that made her heart race. They sat together on the couch, the wine flowing as their conversation drifted from light-hearted topics to more personal, vulnerable truths. As the evening went on, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Felipe leaned in closer, his knee brushing against hers. Amy's breath caught as she felt the warmth of his hand grazing hers when he reached for his glass. Neither of them pulled away. The air between them grew heavy, charged with something unspoken. "Amy," Felipe said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I feel like I can tell you anything. You understand me in a way no one else does." She looked at him, her heart pounding. "Felipe, I..." Her voice faltered. She wanted to say something, to draw a line, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, Felipe reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered, brushing against her cheek. "You're amazing, Amy," he murmured. "I don't know how you've hidden yourself away for so long." Amy felt a surge of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She tried to remind herself of all the reasons this was wrong. Eddie, their age difference, the complications, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. All she could feel was the pull between them, growing stronger with every passing second. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," Felipe replied, his gaze locked on hers. I want you to know how I feel. And if you feel the same, even just a little, that's enough for me." Amy's heart raced as his words sank in. She felt vulnerable, exposed, but also exhilarated. For so long she had buried her desires, convincing herself that her time for love and passion had passed. But here was Felipe, seeing her, wanting her, making her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The space between them disappeared as Felipe leaned in. His hand brushed against her arm, sending a shiver down her spine. Amy's breath hitched as his face drew closer, his intentions unmistakable. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to pull away, but her body betrayed her, leaning into him instead. Their lips met, tentative at first, then growing more urgent as the weight of their suppressed feelings came crashing down. Amy felt her hands move on their own, gripping Felipe's shoulders as his arms encircled her waist. The kiss was electric, a mix of passion and longing that left her breathless. When they finally pulled apart, Amy's cheeks were flushed, her heart racing. "Felipe, this is..." She began, but he interrupted her. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend anymore, Amy. You mean more to me than I can put into words." Amy looked into his eyes, searching for something, doubt, hesitation, anything that would make this easier to walk away from. But all she saw was sincerity, a raw honesty that made her chest ache. For the rest of the evening, they talked, their barriers fully broken. Felipe shared stories of his childhood, his struggles with loneliness, his dreams of finding someone who truly understood him. Amy opened up about Charlie, the pain of losing him, and the loneliness that had consumed her since. By the time Felipe left that night, the line between them had been crossed, and there was no going back. Amy knew she was venturing into dangerous territory, but a part of her didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt wanted, desired, and alive. As she closed the door behind him, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She knew the risks, the potential fallout, but she couldn't ignore the spark Felipe had reignited within her. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and as she stood there in the quiet of her home, she realized she wasn't sure she wanted it to stop. Amy tried to carry on with her life as though nothing had changed, but the weight of what had happened with Felipe lingered. Every time she saw Eddie or received a text from him, guilt gnawed at her. She told herself that the kiss, the conversations, the growing intimacy, it had all been a momentary lapse in judgment. But deep down she knew better. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It was something far more dangerous. Felipe, however, didn't seem to share her reservations. His texts became more frequent, and his visits to the house didn't stop. If anything, they grew more deliberate. He would find excuses to stop by when Eddie wasn't home, bringing small gifts or asking for Amy's advice on trivial matters. Each time, their conversations grew deeper, their moments together more charged. The unspoken connection between them was impossible to ignore. It all came to a head one evening when Eddie came home earlier than expected. Amy had been sitting in the living room with Felipe, their conversation light, but tinged with the tension that had become their norm. Felipe was leaning forward, his hand resting on the edge of the couch just inches from hers. They were so engrossed in their exchange that they didn't hear the front door open. "Amy? Felipe?" Eddie's voice rang out, startling them both. Amy shot up from the couch, her heart pounding. Felipe leaned back, trying to appear casual, but the suddenness of Eddie's arrival had thrown them both off balance. Eddie stepped into the living room, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes darting between them. "Nothing," Amy said quickly, forcing a smile. Felipe just stopped by to drop something off. Eddie's gaze lingered on them for a moment, suspicion flickering across his face. "Right," he said slowly. "Well, I'm starving. What's for dinner?" The moment passed, but the unease lingered. Amy knew Eddie wasn't convinced, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the delicate balance she'd been trying to maintain was beginning to crumble. It wasn't long before the truth came out. Eddie wasn't oblivious. He had noticed the subtle changes in Amy's demeanor, the way Felipe seemed to show up more often than before. He had overheard snippets of conversations, noticed the lingering looks, the tension that hung in the air whenever they were in the same room. One afternoon, when Amy was in the kitchen preparing lunch, Eddie confronted her. "Mom, is there something going on between you and Felipe?" he asked, his voice tight. Amy froze, the knife in her hand trembling. She turned to face him, her heart racing. "What are you talking about, Eddie?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his tone sharp. "I'm not blind, Mom. I see the way he looks at you. And the way you look at him. Just tell me the truth." Amy's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to tell Eddie he was imagining things, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He already knew. There was no point in lying. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It just did." Eddie's face twisted in anger and disbelief. "You're kidding me," he said, his voice rising. "Felipe? My best friend? Do you have any idea how messed up this is?" Amy tried to explain, to make him understand, but every word she said only seemed to make things worse. Eddie stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Amy was left standing in the kitchen, her chest heaving with the weight of her emotions. She felt like her world was falling apart. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Eddie stopped speaking to both Amy and Felipe. He moved out of the house and refused to answer Amy's calls or texts. Felipe tried to reach out to him as well, but his efforts were met with silence. The betrayal Eddie felt was too deep, too raw, and it threatened to sever the bonds between all of them. Amy and Felipe were left to face the consequences of their actions alone. For weeks, Amy barely left the house, consumed by guilt and regret. She and Felipe continued to see each other, their connection stronger than ever, but the shadow of what they had done loomed over them. Every stolen moment was tinged with the knowledge of the pain they had caused. One evening, Felipe showed up at Amy's door, his face etched with determination. "We can't keep living like this," he said. "We need to talk to Eddie. Together." Amy hesitated. The thought of facing her son, of seeing the hurt in his eyes again, was almost too much to bear. But Felipe was right. They couldn't keep running from the truth. The next day, they went to Eddie's apartment. He opened the door, his expression cold and guarded. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. We need to talk, Felipe said, stepping forward. All of us. Eddie hesitated, then reluctantly let them in. The conversation that followed was raw and painful. Amy and Felipe laid everything out in the open, explaining how their relationship had developed and how much they regretted hurting Eddie. They didn't try to justify their actions, but instead focused on their desire to rebuild the trust that had been broken. Eddie listened in silence, his jaw clenched and his eyes filled with anger and betrayal. When they finished, he stood and paced the room, his emotions boiling over. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally, his voice shaking. Either of you. Amy's heart broke at his words, but she nodded. I understand, she said softly. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Felipe stepped forward, his voice steady. Eddie, I never meant to hurt you. You're like a brother to me, and I hate that I've put you in this position. But I can't lie about how I feel about your mom. She's everything to me. Eddie turned away, his shoulders heaving. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I need time, he said. A lot of time. Amy and Felipe left the apartment feeling a mix of relief and heartbreak. The road to healing would be long and uncertain, but they had taken the first step. That night, as Amy sat alone in her living room, she couldn't help but reflect on how her life had changed. The choices she had made had shattered the fragile peace she once knew, but they had also forced her to confront truths she had buried for far too long. The story wasn't over, not for Amy, Felipe, or Eddie. But for the first time, Amy felt a glimmer of hope that, one day, they might find a way forward. Together. The days following their confrontation with Eddie were the hardest of Amy's life. She hadn't realized how much her relationship with her son had been her anchor, even as he had grown older and started his own life. Now, that anchor was gone, leaving her adrift in a sea of guilt and uncertainty. Eddie's absence was deafening. He stopped answering her calls, left her messages unread, and even avoided Felipe entirely. Amy tried to stay strong, telling herself that time would heal the wounds she had caused. But as the days turned to weeks, her guilt grew heavier. She replayed her choices in her mind over and over, questioning how she had allowed things to go so far. The passion she had felt with Felipe, the way he had reignited a part of her she thought was long dead. It had come at a price she wasn't sure she was prepared to pay. Felipe wasn't faring much better. His once easygoing demeanor had been replaced with a quiet tension. He hated the rift he had caused between Amy and Eddie, and his guilt over betraying his best friend consumed him. Yet his feelings for Amy hadn't wavered. If anything, they had grown stronger, and he struggled to reconcile the love he felt for her with the damage they had done. One evening, Felipe showed up at Amy's door, his face etched with exhaustion. We need to talk, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Amy nodded, her heart sinking. She knew this conversation was inevitable. I've been thinking about everything, Felipe began, his voice heavy. About Eddie, about us, about where this is all going. I hate what this has done to him. I hate that I've hurt him. But Amy. He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. I don't regret falling for you. Tears welled up in Amy's eyes as she looked at him. Felipe, I don't regret it either. But what if we've broken something that can't be fixed? What if Eddie never forgives us? Felipe stepped closer, taking her hands in his. Then we'll keep trying. We'll keep showing him that this wasn't about betrayal. It was about something real. Something we couldn't ignore. Amy nodded, but the uncertainty in her heart remained. She wanted to believe Felipe's words, but the weight of what they had done was a constant presence, a shadow that followed her everywhere. Meanwhile, Eddie was struggling with his own emotions. He couldn't look at Felipe or Amy without feeling a surge of anger and betrayal, but he also couldn't deny the love he had for both of them. Felipe had been like a brother to him, and Amy was his mother, the one person who had always been there for him, no matter what. Yet their actions had shattered his trust, and he didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. Eddie threw himself into his work, using the long hours and constant distractions to avoid dealing with his emotions. But late at night, when the world was quiet, the pain would resurface. He would think about the moments he had shared with his mom and Felipe, the memories that now felt tainted, and wonder if things could ever go back to the way they were. Months passed, and the distance between them remained. Amy reached out to Eddie regularly, leaving voicemails and sending texts, but his responses were brief and guarded. Felipe tried to repair their friendship as well, but every attempt was met with silence. It wasn't until Amy sent Eddie a heartfelt letter that things began to shift. In the letter, Amy poured out her heart, acknowledging the pain she had caused and taking full responsibility for her actions. She told Eddie how much she loved him, how proud she was of the man he had become, and how deeply she regretted the hurt she had caused. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only for a chance to rebuild their relationship. A week later, Eddie showed up at her door. His face was drawn, his eyes tired, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, something that gave Amy hope. "I read your letter," he said simply, stepping inside. Amy's heart raced as she motioned for him to sit. "I'm so glad you're here, Eddie," she said softly. "I've missed you so much." Eddie nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've missed you too, Mom. But it's going to take time." "I understand," Amy said, her voice trembling. "I'll give you all the time you need." Their conversation was cautious, tentative, but it was a start. For the first time in months, Amy felt a glimmer of hope that their relationship could be repaired. Felipe, too, began to make progress with Eddie, slowly rebuilding their friendship through small, sincere gestures. The journey was far from over. The scars of what had happened would take years to fade, and their relationships would never be the same. But Amy and Felipe were determined to face the consequences of their actions together. They knew they couldn't undo the past, but they could work toward a future built on honesty, love, and the lessons they had learned. As for Eddie, he wasn't ready to forgive completely, but he wasn't ready to walk away either. And for Amy, that was enough for now. The months that followed were a delicate balance of rebuilding and reflection for everyone involved. Amy, Felipe, and Eddie were no longer the same people they had been before the events that upended their lives, but slowly they began to find a new rhythm, a way forward that honored their shared history while acknowledging the mistakes they had made. For Amy, the journey was one of self-discovery and acceptance. She had spent so many years burying her desires and locking herself away in her grief that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live. Felipe had awakened something in her, a passion, a hunger for connection, but he had also forced her to confront the consequences of pursuing her own happiness at the expense of others. Through her conversations with Eddie, Amy learned to listen in a way she never had before. She stopped trying to justify her actions and instead focused on understanding the depth of her son's pain. Eddie's anger didn't vanish overnight, but with time, he began to see the woman behind the mother. The woman who had struggled with loneliness and loss and had made a choice, however flawed, to find joy again. Felipe's journey was equally transformative. He had always prided himself on being confident and self-assured, but the fallout with Eddie shook him to his core. It forced him to reflect on the kind of man he wanted to be and the values he wanted to uphold. He worked tirelessly to regain Eddie's trust, not through grand gestures but through quiet consistency, showing up, being honest, and proving that his love for Amy didn't diminish his respect for Eddie. As for Eddie, the road to forgiveness was complicated and nonlinear. There were days when the sight of Felipe and Amy together still made his chest tighten with anger. But there were also moments when he saw how happy his mom seemed, how alive she looked in a way he hadn't seen in years. Slowly, he began to understand that her choice, while painful, wasn't born out of malice or betrayal but out of a deep longing for connection. One evening, as the three of them sat together for dinner, a tentative but significant milestone, Eddie finally broke the silence that had lingered for so long. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "And I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it. But I can see that you make each other happy. And I guess that's what matters, right?" Amy's eyes filled with tears as she reached for her son's hand. "It means the world to me that you're even willing to try," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." Felipe nodded, his gaze earnest. "I'll do the same, Eddie. You're like a brother to me, and I hate that I hurt you. But I promise, I'll never stop proving to you that I care about you. And your mom." The conversation marked a turning point for all of them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, there were still wounds to heal and trust to rebuild. But it was a start. For the first time in months, they felt like a family again, albeit a new, more complicated version of one. As Amy lay in bed that night, reflecting on the dinner and Eddie's tentative words of acceptance, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't the unshaken peace of a life untouched by mistakes or heartbreak. It was the kind that comes from facing the storm and surviving it. She realized that her choices, though imperfect, had brought her closer to understanding herself and the people she loved. She thought about Charlie, her late husband, and the life they had built together. For years after his death, she had clung to his memory as a shield, protecting herself from the world outside. But now she understood that loving Charlie didn't mean she had to remain trapped in the past. Life had given her a second chance at love, and while it had come in an unexpected and messy form, it was no less meaningful. Felipe had taught her that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. His steady presence, his unwavering commitment to her, and his willingness to face the fallout alongside her had shown her what it meant to truly let someone in. He wasn't just a source of passion, he was her partner, her equal, someone who saw her not as a widow or a mother, but as a woman deserving of love. For Eddie, the journey was still ongoing. While he wasn't ready to fully forgive, he was beginning to see his mother and Felipe as human, flawed, yes, but capable of growth and redemption. He had started to recognize that their connection, as difficult as it was for him to accept, had brought something valuable into his mother's life. And in time, he hoped he could find a way to let go of the resentment that still lingered in his heart. As the days turned into months, the three of them began to rebuild. Their relationships were no longer defined by what had been lost, but by the efforts they were making to move forward. Family dinners became more frequent. Laughter slowly returned to their conversations, and the tension that once dominated their interactions began to fade. Amy often thought about the lessons she had learned through it all. She realized that love, true meaningful love, wasn't always neat or easy. It required courage, vulnerability, and the willingness to face consequences. It demanded honesty, even when the truth was painful, and forgiveness, even when it felt impossible. In the end, the story wasn't about betrayal or forbidden love. It was about resilience, the power of second chances, and the importance of finding connection in a world that often feels isolating. It was a reminder that life doesn't always unfold according to plan, but that doesn't mean it can't still lead to something beautiful. As Amy stood on the porch one quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Felipe joined her, his hand slipping into hers. She glanced at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had weathered the storm together, and while the path ahead might still hold challenges, they were ready to face them, together. "I never thought I'd find this again," Amy said softly, leaning into him. Felipe smiled, his eyes warm. "You deserve this, Amy. We both do." And for the first time in years, Amy truly believed it. If you were in Eddie's shoes, would you ever be able to forgive? Or if you were in Amy's, would you take the risk for love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more emotionally charged stories like this one. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next chapter. It's even more unexpected,